country with $12 trillion less in GDP just canceled its trade deal with the United States. Not paused, nullified it, and Washington did nothing.
Malaysia's trade deal with the US is facing growing scrutiny, not only from the opposition, but from within the government itself.
Here is why that moment is more dangerous than it looks. Malaysia did not defeat the United States in a negotiation. It exposed something far more dangerous. American trade power was never in the tariffs. It was in the system behind them. And that system just lost one of its key enforcement layers. Last October, Malaysia signed a reciprocal trade deal with the United States. Tariffs dropped from 47% to 19%. In return, Malaysia gave concessions, market access, regulatory changes, policy alignment, face asymmetric punishment, or comply. That architecture was not really about tariff numbers. It was about selective enforcement. The ability to hit one country harder than its competitors, to create a pressure differential that forced concessions, to make the cost of resistance higher than the cost of compliance. Tariffs were never the system. They were the visible layer of it. And for a while, that visible layer worked exactly as designed. Through 2025, Trump's sign has similar reciprocal frameworks with the UK, the EU, China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Argentina, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Bangladesh, and Switzerland. Each deal followed the same internal logic. The threat of asymmetric punishment created a pressure differential. Countries facing 47%, while their competitors faced 10%, had a clear incentive to negotiate. The leverage was not in the number itself. It was in the gap between numbers. That gap is what the entire architecture rested on. Then the enforcement layer broke. On February 20th, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act were unconstitutional. Chief Justice Roberts wrote that IEEPA contains no reference to tariffs or duties and that no president had ever read the law to grant such power. The Tax Foundation estimates over $160 billion in tariffs were collected under IEEPA, and all of it is now deemed illegal. Within hours, they were replaced with a flat 10% rate and applied equally to every country, regardless of whether they had signed a deal or not. And that is the moment the enforcement mechanism failed. Not because tariffs disappeared, because they became uniform. When everyone pays 10%, differentiation is gone. Base selective pressure is gone. The penalty for refusing to sign is gone. The entire logic depended on one country facing a worse outcome than its competitors if it refused. Remove that differential and the deals lose their internal logic entirely. Malaysia looked at the numbers. 19% with the deal, 10% without it. So it tested the system directly, and the system did not respond in any meaningful way. The trade minister did not soften the language. The exact words were, "It is not on hold. It is no longer there. It is null and void." What Malaysia actually did was not outmaneuver Washington in a negotiation. It identified that the enforcement layer had failed, acted on that conclusion publicly, and waited. The response was threats on social media. No consequential action followed. Every trade ministry in the world is watching that gap between threat and response. That gap is where control fails. If this kind of system-level analysis is useful to you, hit subscribe. This channel covers the control points most coverage misses entirely. New analysis every week. Now here is where most analysis stops. Malaysia won, America lost leverage, the deals are collapsing. That is the surface reading. The more important question is structural. What was that leverage actually resting on, and how much of it is still intact? Global trade does not run on agreements. It runs on infrastructure. Dollar settlement, shipping insurance, legal enforcement, market access. Those are the real control points. Tariffs are pressure tools layered on top of that infrastructure. The infrastructure did not move. The foundation stayed in place. Dollar-denominated settlement still means the vast majority of international transactions which flow through the U.S. financial system. Shipping insurance underwriting remains anchored in Western financial networks. Legal enforcement of commercial contracts still depends on access to U.S. and EU court systems. Sanctions architecture, SWIFT access, correspondent banking, these operate entirely independently of IEEPA. The American consumer market of 335 million people did not relocate. So the precise question is not whether the United States lost trade leverage. It is whether it lost one enforcement layer within a much larger control architecture. And the answer is specifically yes. The selective tariff mechanism is gone. But the ability to say you get 47% and your competitor gets 10% has been ruled unconstitutional and replaced with a flat rate that treats everyone identically. That tool, the pressure differential, the asymmetric punishment instrument, is no longer available. But watch what remains. This is where most people get it wrong. Dollar clearing intact, financial sanctions intact, market access intact, legal and insurance infrastructure intact. What the Supreme Court decision removed was the most visible and most publicly deployed layer of a multi-layered system, not the system itself. That distinction matters because it changes what this moment actually is. This is not the collapse of American economic power. It is the failure of a specific enforcement mechanism that was being overextended. The IEEPA architecture tried to apply asymmetric tariff pressure across dozens of countries simultaneously. That overextension is what the court struck down. The system was not defeated. It hit its own limits. India was supposed to sign its deal. The agreement included commitments to buy $500 billion in American products over 5 years, eliminate tariffs on U.S. industrial and agricultural goods, and halt Russian oil imports. India's Commerce Secretary confirmed they will not sign until the U.S. finalizes a new tariff framework. A senior official stated directly that any nation enters into an agreement only when it perceives a market advantage relative to other competing nations. That advantage has now vanished. An Indian government source went further, Bush describing the new Section 301 investigations as a pressure tactic to force countries into signing deals after the court order. Once the primary enforcement mechanism fails, secondary tools get deployed. But secondary tools are slower, narrower, and more legally exposed. The European Union froze ratification of its deal in late February. A senior official from the European Parliament's Trade Committee stated that a key instrument used on the U.S. side to negotiate and implement the deal is no longer available. That is not political disagreement. That is a recognition that the enforcement architecture has changed. And here is what is happening in parallel. Among the 60 countries under new Section 301 investigations are nations that have already signed deals: Malaysia, India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia. So countries that gave real concessions, locked into real commitments, accepted real economic costs to reduce their tariff exposure, and they are still being investigated. That sequence communicates something precise. Signing a deal does not protect you, which removes the incentive to sign at all. So what replaced IEEPA? Weaker tools with tighter constraints. Section 122, the replacement authority, caps at 15% and expires in 150 days unless Congress votes to extend it. That deadline lands in mid-July, months before the midterm elections. Members of Congress would have to take a recorded vote on tariffs at precisely the moment voters are paying attention to prices. The Brookings Institution noted this directly. That is a structural constraint, not a rhetorical one. Section 301 investigations require specific industry-by-industry findings, documented evidence of unfair trade practices, and face potential legal challenge. They cannot replicate the speed or scale of the original IEEPA architecture. The countries most likely to follow Malaysia in the next 60 days are not the ones looking for confrontation. They are the ones running the same calculation. Japan accepted tariffs around 15% with significant procurement concessions. South Korea accepted similar terms. Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh all made real concessions for preferential treatment that no longer exists. These are not ideological decisions. They are arithmetic. Before the ruling, the leverage structure was asymmetric in America's favor. Refuse to sign and face crushing tariffs. Negotiate and face reduced tariffs. The differential created pressure. Now the structure has inverted. Countries that signed deals face 10% like everyone else, plus ongoing investigations, plus commitments they gave to avoid tariffs that no longer exist. The rational position, from a pure system standpoint, is to do what Malaysia did. The longer-term question is whether the failure of this specific mechanism accelerates a structural reassessment of the broader control architecture. For decades, the underlying logic of U.S. trade and financial leverage rested on a bundle of control points operating together: tariff access, dollar settlement, sanctions networks, market access, financial system integration. These were not separate policies. They were a system, reinforcing each other. The strength of any individual tool derived partly from the credibility of the whole bundle. If you resisted tariffs, the other instruments could be activated. The bundle created deterrence. When one instrument in that bundle is publicly removed by a domestic court ruling, the deterrence calculus shifts, not catastrophically, not immediately, but measurably. Countries begin stress testing which parts of the bundle are legally durable, which are politically constrained, which require congressional action, which can be challenged in international arbitration. Malaysia ran that analysis. The conclusion was that the IEEPA layer was gone and the Section 122 replacement was capped, temporary, and politically exposed. That analytical process is now running in every major trade ministry simultaneously. Malaysia is the canary not because it is large, but because it was first. A smaller economy made a calculated decision that the enforcement layer had failed, acted on that decision publicly, and faced no consequential response. Every country watching that sequence is updating its risk model in real time, not based on what Washington is saying, based on what Washington actually did. The enforcement layer failed, the leverage mechanism broke, but the system is still there. And now every country is asking the same question, not whether the United States has power, but which parts of that power still work. Malaysia answered one of those questions for the first time in a long time. The answer was no. Now everyone else is about to test the rest. If you are not subscribed yet, this is the kind of analysis you get every week. The control points. The system fails. The move's most coverage never reaches. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.